When we left him, Benjamin Siegel had been given a reprieve he did not fully understand he needed, by an oldest friend who could only delay his fate, not cancel it. Months passed. The Flamingo kept improving. The trust that had already been broken in Havana did not. And on a warm June evening in Beverly Hills, the delay finally ran out. In March of 1947, 3 months before the end, Siegel attended a business meeting concerning the Flamingo and the wider race wire operation he still controlled. According to accounts of the meeting, he turned on his own Las Vegas partner, a man named Mo Sedway, and threatened him directly. The specific words attributed to him, "I'll have Mo shot." We want you to notice something about this moment, because it tells you everything about where Siegel's mind actually was 3 months before his own murder. He was not behaving like a man who suspected, even faintly, that his own life hung by a thread his oldest friend had only barely managed to extend. He was behaving exactly as he always had, impulsive, certain of his own untouchability, willing to threaten a business partner in front of witnesses, without any apparent awareness that the entire organization around him had already discussed, in explicit terms, whether he himself deserved to live. The boy Meyer Lansky had described at 12 years old, brave, impulsive, always ready to act first, was still very much present in the room. He simply did not know how little time that boy had left. A week before his death, Virginia Hill had an argument with Siegel. The exact subject of the argument is not preserved in any detailed record that survives. What is documented is the outcome. Hill left the country, flying to Paris in what multiple accounts describe as an abrupt departure following the disagreement. She was, therefore, not in the country at all on the night her own rented Beverly Hills mansion became the scene of one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. We are not going to tell you right now what to make of that timing. We are simply going to note it clearly, the way the record requires us to, and ask you to hold it in your mind as we walk through what happened next. A woman who had spent her entire adult life moving money quietly for dangerous men, who had been under direct suspicion alongside Siegel for skimming the Flamingo's construction budget, who had access to a private account in Zurich that nobody else fully understood, left the country alone 7 days before the man she loved was shot to death in her own living room. The address was 810 North Linden Drive, Beverly Hills. A rented Moorish-style mansion, leased in Virginia Hill's name. Ornate, fashionable. Exactly the kind of property a courier for the Chicago outfit, who had reinvented herself as a Hollywood socialite, might choose to call home. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel sat in the living room of that house. He was not alone. His longtime friend Alan Smiley, who had also invested in the Flamingo project, sat with him. Siegel was reading a newspaper. Most accounts specify the Los Angeles Times. He was seated on a sofa in his own rented version of the glamorous, settled domestic life he had spent his entire adult life trying to construct around himself. A life built, ultimately, on syndicate money, stolen credit, and a death sentence he did not fully understand he was still living under. It was, by every account, an entirely ordinary evening, until it wasn't. Someone was outside the window. We do not know, to this day, who that person was. We do not know how long they had been waiting, or how they knew Siegel would be in that specific room, at that specific hour, seated in that specific spot, on that specific sofa. What we know is what came next, and we are going to tell it to you plainly, without embellishment, in the same restrained register this entire series has tried to maintain around violence. An M1 carbine, a .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle, was raised toward the window. 9 shots were fired. In the seconds that followed, the ordinary evening Benjamin Siegel had spent his entire life trying to make permanent ended forever. 4 of the 9 shots struck Siegel. 2 hit his head. One of them tore through his right eye socket with such force that the eye itself was found later on the tiled floor of the dining room, roughly 15 feet from where he had been sitting. He died instantly. He did not suffer. The shots that missed him did not miss the room. One destroyed a marble statue of Bacchus standing on top of a grand piano. Another punctured a painting hanging nearby, a nude woman holding a glass of wine. The kind of small, almost theatrically ironic detail that the press seized on within hours. Because even in death, the room around Benjamin Siegel seemed determined to perform glamour right up until the moment it was destroyed. Alan Smiley, seated beside him on the same sofa, dove to the floor the instant the shooting began. He was not hit. A single bullet tore through the sleeve of his jacket, close enough to feel, close enough to leave a mark on the fabric, not close enough to draw blood. He would go on, in the years that followed, to relocate to Houston, Texas, and build a second life for himself as an oil man, a man who had once sat beside one of the most notorious figures in American organized crime on the night of his murder, and who walked away from it with nothing more than a torn sleeve, and eventually, a completely different career in a completely different industry, far from Beverly Hills, far from Las Vegas, far from anyone who might ask him too many questions about what he actually saw. We are going to come back to Alan Smiley. He is not finished with this story yet. Neither, it turns out, is his family. Roughly 20 minutes after the shooting, 3 men walked into the Flamingo Hotel. Their names were Mo Sedway, Gus Greenbaum, and Morris Rosen. They announced, to staff and to anyone within earshot, that Benjamin Siegel was dead and that they were now in control of the property. 20 minutes. We want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it is one of the single most important pieces of circumstantial evidence in this entire case, and it has nothing to do with forensics or fingerprints or any physical trace left at the scene of the murder itself. 20 minutes is not enough time to improvise a coordinated business takeover in response to a surprise killing. It is barely enough time to hear the news, confirm it, and travel across town. What it is enough time for is the execution of a plan that had already been prepared, a contingency that existed before the shots were fired, ready to be activated the instant they were. This was not chaos responding to chaos. This was a transition of ownership that had been waiting for its cue. There is a second detail from that same night that deserves equal attention because it tells you something the takeover alone does not. Almost immediately after the shooting, Alan Smiley placed a telephone call. The man he called was waiting in a phone booth just outside the Flamingo Hotel. A man neither Smiley nor anyone else in the organization knew was, at that time, a confidential informant working for a Las Vegas-based FBI agent named Curtis Lynham. Smiley told him, according to the record this call later produced, that Siegel had been shot in the face and chest, and that he knew Siegel was dead. This means something specific and important. Federal law enforcement had near real-time insight into the mob's own internal reaction to the killing, transmitted unknowingly through one of its own inner circle, within minutes of the murder itself. And still, despite that insight, despite the takeover, despite everything investigators were able to piece together in the days and years that followed, nobody was ever charged. More than 75 years later, the murder of Benjamin Siegel remains officially open, unsolved, uncharged, unresolved, in the strict legal sense, despite being one of the most thoroughly discussed and theorized killings in the entire history of American organized crime. No weapon was ever recovered as physical evidence. The carbine used in the shooting is believed to have been abandoned somewhere on a nearby property, but it has never been located, never tested, never entered into any court record as proof of anything. This is worth sitting with because it means something specific about how this story is allowed to end. We cannot tell you who pulled the trigger. Nobody can. Not with the certainty this entire series has tried to hold itself to whenever the historical record allows for it. What we can tell you is who has been suspected, by whom, and on what basis. And we are going to walk through all of it, honestly, before we tell you about the newest and strangest development in this case. The most widely credited theory among historians is the simplest one. This was a syndicate-ordered hit, the direct fulfillment of the death sentence voted on in Havana, carried out once the Flamingo's continued financial troubles made it clear the conditional reprieve had expired. Some researchers go further, suggesting that Meyer Lansky himself, despite his documented passionate defense of Siegel at that very conference, ultimately authorized or simply accepted the hit once it became clear there was no more time left to buy. Others point toward Virginia Hill's conveniently timed absence in Paris, theorizing that her departure may have been arranged specifically to remove her from the house before the shooting occurred. A smaller, far less corroborated theory involves Hill's brother, a Marine sometimes referred to as Chick Hill, suggested by some as having acted independently to avenge his sister against Siegel's treatment of her. This theory has minimal supporting evidence and belongs, honestly, in the category of speculation rather than serious historical contention. And still others connect the murder to broader disputes over control of the gambling wire service across the western United States, entirely separate from the Flamingo itself. Mo Sedway, the same man Siegel had threatened to have shot 3 months before his own death, and one of the 3 men who walked into the Flamingo 20 minutes after the murder to claim it, has also been named by some researchers as having had, in their words, something to do with the killing. We want to be honest with you about what all of this adds up to, because false certainty would betray everything this series has tried to do across the last 4 parts. It adds up to motive, opportunity, and a deeply compromised circle of suspects, every one of whom benefited in some way from Benjamin Siegel's death. It does not add up to proof. 75 years of theorizing, investigating, and retelling have produced an enormous amount of circumstantial weight, and not one single piece of evidence strong enough to support a criminal charge. That is, until very recently. In 2025 and 2026, a new claim entered this 75-year-old story, and we want to walk you through it carefully, because the way this claim is handled matters enormously. A woman named Llewellyn Smiley, 79 years old, the daughter of Alan Smiley, the man who sat beside Benjamin Siegel on that sofa and walked away with nothing more than a torn jacket sleeve, came forward publicly with a claim about her father. She says he privately confessed to her at some point before his own death that he was the one who killed Benjamin Siegel. We need to be completely clear about what this claim is and what it is not. It is a second-hand account from a single source describing a private conversation that cannot be independently verified by anyone else about an event that occurred more than 7 decades ago, involving a man who is no longer alive to confirm or deny it himself. It is not new physical evidence. It is not a recovered weapon. It is not independent corroboration of any kind. And yet, it is worth taking seriously, precisely because of who is making it. If true, this would mean that the man sitting closest to Benjamin Siegel on the night he died, the friend who dove for the floor as 9 shots came through the window, the man whose torn sleeve became one of the most repeated small details in the entire mythology of this case, was not simply a witness who got lucky. He was, on this account, the shooter himself, positioned with a plausible cover story that history accepted without serious challenge for 75 years, because nobody ever had a reason to look more closely at the one man in the room who survived. There is no recovered carbine to test against this claim. There are no other living witnesses. Alan Smiley himself died decades ago and cannot be questioned about any of it. What exists is a daughter's memory of a private confession, made public for reasons that are entirely her own, more than 75 years after the fact. We are not going to tell you this solves the case. We are going to tell you that it reopens it. One journalist covering this story, writing about the strange, unresolved feeling of a 75-year-old murder suddenly acquiring new and unverifiable life, put it this way: in a city built on illusions, it is a reminder that the truth about who killed Bugsy Siegel may have been sitting on that couch the whole time. We are going to let that observation stand exactly as it was written, attributed, qualified, offered as exactly what it is. One writer's striking way of capturing how strange it feels for a case this old to suddenly, quietly, become uncertain again. Not resolved, uncertain, reopened. Sitting, once more, in the same unfinished state it has occupied for 3/4 of a century. This is where the actual historical record leaves us, as of right now. We need to close this series the way we opened it, with the myth, and with what actually happened underneath it. Despite everything we have shown you across these 5 parts, the stalled hotel that was never his idea, the budget he could not control, the death sentence voted on in a hotel ballroom by men who considered him a line item, the murder that remains legally unsolved to this day, Benjamin Siegel's posthumous legend only grew larger after his death. The syndicate that killed him inherited, within 20 minutes, the property he had only ever managed and never actually founded. Hollywood turned him into archetype, most directly in Warren Beatty's 1991 film simply titled Bugsy, and indirectly through Mario Puzo's The Godfather, whose character Mo Green borrows Siegel's affiliations, his role in Las Vegas, his flamboyant personality, and even echoes his death, shot through the eye, almost exactly as it happened in that Beverly Hills living room. In 1998, more than 50 years after his murder, a Las Vegas investment group announced plans for a $130 million resort named in his honor. The myth had become more valuable than the man ever was. He did not see an empty desert and build a city from nothing. He took a stalled project from a man who had run out of money. He spent 6 times the budget trying to prove, to a room full of people who had known him since he was a child, that he had become something he had spent his entire life pretending to be. He was killed by the same organization that made him, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with vision and almost everything to do with trust. And none of that was enough to stop the legend. Las Vegas still tells the story the easy way: a visionary, an empty desert, a man who saw the future and built it with nothing but nerve. We have spent 5 parts showing you why that story is wrong. We have not spent 5 parts pretending the true story is any less remarkable. A boy from Williamsburg who ran a protection racket before he was a teenager, who became one of the most trusted killers in American organized crime, who chased glamour his entire life and very nearly caught it, who died on a sofa reading a newspaper, shot through a window by someone whose identity remains, more than 75 years later, genuinely unknown. That is who built the legend everyone still believes. He never built anything else.